Professor Paul, our cruel treatment of Native Americans is one of the themes in your book. I learned a lot, for example, about the Trail of Tears, that President Van Buren had a big role in his sort of merciless implementation, perhaps even a bigger role than President Jackson, who had started it all. President Polk's 1884 no, I'm sorry, 1844. President Polk's 1844 victory was partially attributed to Native Americanism, which is an interesting term. It has nothing to do with what we now call Native Americans, right? And what we used to call American Indians until recently. In fact, Native Americanism of Polk's time, the 1840s, and for decades thereafter throughout history, including the 1920s, which we had the Red Scare and xenophobia and what have you, was against Native Americans, American Indians, right?
That's right. Yes, exactly. Nativism comes from Native American. Native American referred to white people who lived in this country for generations or more, and who opposed immigrants, opposed indigenous tribes. And the term Native American is a relatively recent vintage. I know a lot of people who are active in the American Indian movement, and the leaders of the American Indian movement have said to me that, or some of the leaders have said to me that people who actually grew up on reservations, older people, tribal people, have preferenced the term Indian because that's the term they grew up with, as opposed to Native American. Native American, if you think about it, is also kind of it's a kind of anachronistic term, because the word America, of course, comes from Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator. And why would the people who were members of the tribal nations think of themselves as Americans? But
in Canada, they call them First Nation, which is,
I think is a better, much better.
It is,
term.
Yeah.
Because the truth is that they were nations. They were nations the same as the Germans or the French or the British. They were nations, and they may not have had states as such, but they had national identities and languages and cultures, and it makes more sense to think of them as nations.
Do elements of nativism or Native Americanism, the way that it existed in the 1840s, and still persist in the Republican Party?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what are we seeing right now in the spectacle on the floor of the House of Representatives, where the Speaker of the House has really no control over his own party? What we see is we see a party which has really gone off the rails, with a kind of with one faction of people who are really reverting to the sort of Jacksonian ideas of populist racism, who believe essentially in white supremacy, who believe that immigrants don't belong here, who deny America's past as an immigrant nation, who basically want power for power's sake, and who appeal to this notion of a white Christian nation that never existed. Our framers weren't white Christians. Many of them weren't white Christians. Many of the most powerful, important founding fathers of our country were not Christian.
You mean they were not practicing Christian, or
no? I mean, they were not to identify as Christians, not in the modern sense of Christian. So, I mean, it's true that Washington was baptized as an Anglican, but he didn't go to church. And it's not exactly clear that he thought of himself as a Christian. He never used Christian terminology when he talked about God. He talked about God. He used Native American terms. He talked about, divine providence, or the great father, or something like that. John Quincy Adams was a Unitarian. He wasn't a Christian. Also, Washington was a Mason, and the Masons were deists. The deists were the dominant sort of faith of the cultural elite, or at this point in time. So people like Jefferson were a deist. Madison was a deist. Franklin was a deist. They believed in one God, but not necessarily a Christian God. Jefferson most famously published his version of the New Testament. Only Jefferson would have the chutzpah to do something like this. Jefferson went through the New Testament and cut out all the miracles and just took the teachings literally cut them out of the New Testament, and basically spliced it together and just wrote a book about the teachings of Jesus that didn't see Jesus as a divine figure at all, but as a great prophet, which is how he's seen by other faiths as well. So these people were not Christian. And the notion,
conservative Republicans would not elect Jefferson now, right?
No, I mean, conservative Republicans would have nothing to do with Jefferson now, except maybe some of them would find his racism appealing.
Do you think nativism or Native Americanism sort of went dormant in the Republican Party and came out in 2016 with Trump's nomination, or did elements of it exist in the 20th century and they're just not loud enough for us to hear?
If Trump has any political genius, and I'm not sure that he does, but if anything is to be attributed to Trump's political genius, it is the fact that he revealed for us the deep sense of racism that underlies many people in our country, that underlies a large portion of our population. And he appealed to this with his populist ideas, which were not just racist. The essential idea of populism is the appeal to the majority against the cultural elite, people of wealth, people, immigrants, religious minorities or racial minorities. That's what populists do. That's what they do in this country. That's what they do in other countries as well. They're always about turning the majority against somebody else. That's what Trump did. And whether he knew what he was doing or not, he did it exceptionally well. And so he revealed an underlying dark side to the American psyche. But that dark side of the American psyche had been buried for a century after Webster and Lincoln.
Yeah. In closing, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about my alma mater, where you're a professor of law. As of January 1st, it's no longer UC Hastings College of the Law. Why change the name after some 144 years?
Right. Well, our new name is now University of California College of the Law, San Francisco, known more colloquially as UC Law, San Francisco. That's the new name of the law school. And it was changed because the founder of our school, Serenus Hastings, who was the first Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court and a man of great wealth, he had established the school by a gift of gold to the state, which was the first campus of the University of California. We were the precursor of UC Berkeley or all the other UC campuses.
So far sounds good, right?
Right. What was recently revealed was that Hastings financed, or may have, I should say, that there was some evidence that Serenus Hastings financed what were so-called Indian hunting parties, where white men went out and hunted Native Americans. And he did this allegedly because
I'm sorry, what do you mean by hunted? Are you
literally killed Native Americans? They literally went out and shot and killed Native Americans to drive Native Americans off of land that Hastings either had purchased or wanted to purchase. And so Hastings, allegedly made money by killing Native Americans. That is the allegation. And I say allegation because I am woefully ignorant of all of the evidence on one side or another. There's two different groups of historians who compete with each other. And I don't know that there's a definitive answer to this question, but it was a bad look, certainly,
To say the least. Yeah.
for the law school, which was, we were the first law school established west of the Mississippi. We were the largest law school. I think we still are the largest law school west of the Mississippi, and the oldest. And we didn't want to associate ourselves with that, so we dropped the name, and at a great, enormous cost to the school, because we are now going to spend, I'm told, upwards of $3 million to erase the name from our buildings and our websites and other things.
This, as you say, this is not, and I don't know all the proper names. I'm more into history than I'm into news, really. This is not really like a woke movement or cancel culture or anything like that. As you described this, this is a significant blot on the history of the college, if the allegations are true, right?
If the allegations are true, it is, because the college was literally created with sort of blood money.
Yeah.
But personally, as a historian, I am of two minds about this. On the one hand, frankly, it's smart politics, it's smart branding to disassociate ourselves from Hastings if there's any sort of stain on that name. On the other hand, as a general kind of observation, I am very much opposed to cancel culture because, frankly, and this is what I write about in my history books, our whole history is a history of blood and racism and exploitation. And that's just the way it is. And we could say, Washington was a slaveholder. He made his money. He profited from enslaving other people. And should we change the name of the Washington Monument to the City of Washington? Even Lincoln was a man who made multiple racist statements in his political career. Lincoln, like Daniel Webster, supported the Fugitive Slave Acts, and he did so in order to save the Union. Lincoln,
but that was the political reality of that time, right?
Yeah, Lincoln had no intention of. He was not an abolitionist.
Yeah,
he was not in favor of abolishing slavery. He was in favor of limiting the spread of slavery. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things you can claim about any number of Americans. Hastings' sin is a particularly egregious one, if it's true.
Yeah, that was my point.
But I think that cancel culture is a dangerous thing, and I would much rather, as a historian, that we talk about the sins of our fathers, that we talk about how our country became a great country, and that instead of just simply denying these things happened, we instead say that even people like Jefferson, who was a slaveholder, was capable of great thoughts, and the language that he used in the Declaration of Independence and the language of our Constitution constituted a promise for something better in the future. And it's our obligation as Americans to try to realize the promise of those documents without denying our history.
Professor Paul, that was a great and courageous answer, and I'm really glad that I asked that question. Professor Paul, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Sure.